The workshop was quiet that morning, save for the gentle scrape of sandpaper against wood and the occasional whistle of wind through the small gap in the window frame. I remember how the dust particles danced in the slanting sunlight, how the air carried the rich scent of pine and the sharper tang of varnish. This was Mr. Harmon's domain, a converted garage at the edge of town where he'd been crafting furniture for nearly 40 years. I was 22 that summer, fresh out of college with a business degree I wasn't sure how to use, working part-time at my uncle's hardware store and spending my free hours in this workshop, drawn by something I couldn't quite name. Mr. Harmon, Thomas, though I never called him that, was in his 60s, with hands that told stories his mouth rarely did. They were strong hands, mapped with veins and scars, yet capable of such delicate work that watching him shape would felt like witnessing a kind of magic. He wasn't a talkative man, but when he did speak, his words carried weight, like carefully chosen lumber for an important project. I wasn't officially his apprentice, he'd never taken one, but he tolerated my presence, and over the weeks, began to teach me small things: how to hold a chisel, the difference between types of wood, the importance of grain direction. That particular morning, we were working on a rocking chair commissioned by a young couple expecting their first child. The curve of the runners needed to be perfect, not just for aesthetics, but for the gentle, soothing motion that would someday lull a newborn to sleep. There's something profound about crafting an object that will witness the quiet moments of strangers' lives, that will hold their weight and their stories long after your hands have left it. This was something Mr. Harmon understood deeply, and something I was just beginning to grasp. Craftsmanship isn't just about making things, he told me once, running his palm over a freshly planed board as if reading Braille. It's about making things that matter, things that last. I think about those words often now, how they apply to more than just woodworking, how they speak to relationships, to choices, to the way we build our lives piece by piece. The measuring tape was old, the black markings worn but still legible against the yellow metal. Mr. Harmon had pulled it from his leather apron pocket, extending it along the length of oak weed selected for the arm of the chair. I was holding the wood steady, or trying to, nervous about the responsibility. This piece had been expensive, and a mistake would mean starting over, perhaps with wood of lesser quality if the budget couldn't stretch. The first rule of woodworking, Mr. Harmon said, his voice low and steady, is to measure twice, cut once. He'd told me this before, but today he was demonstrating it with particular care, perhaps sensing my anxiety. He measured from end to end, noted the number, then measured again, his eyes narrowing slightly behind his wire-rimmed glasses. The precision of his movements was hypnotic, no wasted motion, no hesitation. When he asked me to hold the pencil mark he'd made, I leaned in closer. The workshop was cool despite the summer heat outside, but I could feel the warmth radiating from him as he positioned himself beside me, guiding my hand to the exact spot where the cut would need to be made. "Hold steady," he said, his breath warm on my cheek, and I felt a strange flutter in my chest. Not romantic exactly, but intimate in a way I hadn't experienced before. It was the closeness of mentorship, of trust, of someone believing you capable of learning something precious to them. Let me explain why this moment matters so much in my memory. In our digital age, physical proximity has become increasingly rare. We text instead of talk, email instead of meet. The simple act of standing shoulder to shoulder with someone, engaged in a shared task that requires focus and precision. There's a connection there that can't be replicated through a screen. And when that person is someone you respect, someone whose skill level seems almost mythical to you, that proximity becomes a kind of benediction. You are being welcomed into their space, their process. You are being trusted. The measuring tape retracted with a metallic whisper as Mr. Harmon released it. "You know," he said, reaching for a pencil tucked behind his ear, "my father taught me to measure 3 times for important pieces." He smiled slightly, the lines around his eyes deepening. Said it wasn't just about avoiding waste, it was about respect. Respect for the materials, for the work itself. He marked the cutting line with a precise, dark stroke. When you take the time to be certain, you're honoring everything that went into bringing this wood to your hands. The years the tree grew, the labor of those who harvested it, processed it. I nodded, absorbing this perspective. It hadn't occurred to me to think of measurement as an act of reverence rather than simply a practical precaution. But this was how Mr. Harmon approached all aspects of his craft, with a mindfulness that bordered on the spiritual. He wasn't religious in any conventional sense, but there was something almost devotional in his relationship with wood and tools. "Try it," he said, handing me the measuring tape. "Measure from this into my mark. Tell me what you get." My hands weren't as steady as his, and I was acutely aware of his eyes on me as I extended the tape. 34 and 5/8 inches, I said, trying to sound confident. "Measure again," he instructed, not confirming or denying my reading. I did, taking more care this time, making sure the end of the tape was flush against the wood. 34 and 3/4 inches. My stomach sank as I realized I'd gotten it wrong the first time. "And once more," he said, his voice betraying no judgment. The third measurement matched the second, and I looked up at him, expecting disappointment. Instead, he nodded approvingly. "That's why we check. Not because we're careless, but because we're human. Accuracy isn't about never making mistakes. It's about having the patience to catch them before they become permanent." There was something deeply reassuring about this philosophy. In school, mistakes had always felt like failures, marks against my intelligence or worth. But in Mr. Harmon's workshop, they were simply part of the process, expected and accounted for. This approach created a space where I could learn without fear, where precision wasn't about perfection but about care and attention. As the morning progressed, we moved from measuring to cutting, Mr. Harmon guiding me through the use of the bandsaw. The blade hummed threateningly, but his presence beside me was calming. "Keep your fingers clear," he reminded me, unnecessarily. I was keeping them well away from the gleaming steel. "But don't be so tense. The wood can feel your fear." I wasn't sure if he was being literal or metaphorical, but I tried to relax my shoulders, to find a balance between caution and confidence. The cut went smoothly, the saw slicing through the oak with surprising ease under his guidance. The smell of freshly cut wood rose up, sharp and clean. When we turned off the saw, the sudden silence felt profound, as if the whole workshop was holding its breath to see what we had created. Mr. Harmon ran his fingers along the cut edge, checking for roughness. "Not bad," he said, which from him was high praise. "Now we need to shape the curve." He led me to another workbench where various planes and spokeshaves were arranged in neat rows. He selected one and demonstrated the motion, pulling the tool along the wood with smooth, controlled strokes. Shavings curled away like delicate ribbons, falling to the floor in a growing pile. "The thing about curves," he said as he worked, "is that they're more honest than straight lines. In nature, there's no such thing as perfectly straight. Trees grow in response to light, to wind, to the slope of the land. They curve and twist. When we impose straight lines, we're simplifying, abstracting." He paused, examining his progress. "Sometimes that's necessary. But there's truth in curves." I watched, mesmerized by the transformation happening under his hands. The rough-cut edge was gradually becoming smoother, taking on an organic flow that would eventually fit perfectly against the body of someone sitting in the chair. It struck me then that this was a kind of knowing that went beyond intellectual understanding. It was knowledge held in the body, in the subtle adjustments of pressure and angle that came from years of practice and observation. "Would you like to try?" he asked, offering me the spokeshave. I hesitated. The piece was already looking beautiful, and I was afraid of ruining it. Mr. Harmon seemed to read my thoughts. "I'll guide you," he said, "and if it goes wrong, we can always adjust. Wood is forgiving if you know how to ask its permission." This was another aspect of his philosophy that fascinated me, the way he spoke of wood as something alive, something with agency and personality. Each species, each board, even each section of grain had its own character in his eyes. He worked with these characteristics rather than against them, finding ways to highlight the beauty in knots and irregular grain patterns that others might see as flaws. I took the spokeshave, positioning my hands as he had shown. He stood close behind me, his arms reaching around to adjust my grip. "Like this," he said, his voice near my ear, his breath once again warm on my skin. "Feel the grain, don't fight it." His hands guided mine through the first few strokes, and I could feel the resistance of the wood, the way it yielded differently, depending on which direction we moved. Gradually, he released his grip, letting me work independently while he watched. I moved slowly, concentrating intensely on maintaining the smooth curve he had started. When I finished the section, I looked up at him questioningly. He nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You have good hands," he said simply. "Patient hands." The compliment warmed me more than I expected. In my family, academic achievement had always been the measure of success: test scores, grades, degrees. No one had ever commented on my hands, on my ability to create something physical. I looked down at them, seeing them differently for a moment, not just as tools for typing or turning pages, but as instruments capable of shaping, building, bringing ideas into tangible reality. The rest of the morning passed in a rhythm of work and instruction. Mr. Harmon showed me how to sand the curved arm to a silky smoothness, how to test it against the back piece to ensure the angles matched perfectly. Comfort isn't just about cushioning, he explained as we worked. It's about how all the parts relate to each other, how they support the body's natural posture. He demonstrated by sitting in the partially assembled chair, showing how the arm should support the elbow at just the right height, how the back should cradle the spine. Around noon, he stepped outside for his usual cigarette break, his one concession to a habit he'd been trying to quit for decades. I stayed in the workshop, running my hand over our morning's work, marveling at how different the wood felt now compared to when we'd started. The transformation wasn't just in its shape, but in its texture, in the way light played across its surface. When Mr. Harmon returned, he brought with him the smell of tobacco and the sounds of the outside world, a dog barking somewhere down the street, a car passing with music playing. These intrusions from ordinary life always seemed slightly jarring in the workshop, which existed in its own time zone, its own reality. "After lunch, we'll work on the joinery," he said, washing his hands at the small sink in the corner. "That's where the real strength of a piece comes from, not from the nails or screws, but from how the parts fit together." He dried his hands on a cloth that hung from his belt. "A good joint is almost invisible, but it's doing all the work." I thought about this as we ate our sandwiches on the small bench outside the workshop door. The idea that strength could come from connection rather than from external reinforcement seemed profound. Applicable to furniture, yes, but also to relationships, to communities, to any system made up of separate parts working together. The afternoon was dedicated to cutting and fitting the joints that would hold the chair together. This was exacting work, requiring even more precise measurement and careful cutting than the morning's tasks. Mr. Harmon demonstrated each step first, then watched as I attempted to replicate it, offering corrections and encouragements in equal measure. At one point, I made a cut that was slightly off, creating a gap that would be visible in the finished piece. My heart sank as I realized my mistake. "I'm sorry," I said, already calculating the cost of replacing the wood I'd ruined. But Mr. Harmon didn't seem concerned. "Let me show you something," he said, reaching for a small container. He opened it to reveal a mixture of sawdust and glue. "This is how we address small errors. The sawdust is from the same wood, so when it dries and we sand it smooth, the repair will be nearly invisible." He worked the mixture into the gap with a small tool, his movements precise and unhurried. The Japanese have a philosophy called kintsugi, repairing broken pottery with gold. The repair becomes part of the object's history, something to be highlighted rather than hidden. As he worked, I thought about how different this approach was from what I was used to. The emphasis on perfection, on getting things right the first time, on hiding any evidence of mistakes or corrections. There was something deeply humane about acknowledging imperfection, about seeing it as an opportunity for creativity rather than a failure to be ashamed of. The sun was beginning to slant low through the windows when we finally stepped back to survey our day's work. The chair was taking shape, not complete, but clearly emerging from the collection of carefully crafted parts. It would take several more days to finish, but already I could see the beauty it would possess, the comfort it would provide. "Good work today," Mr. Harmon said, wiping his hands on his apron. "You're learning quickly." I felt a surge of pride at his words, at the evidence of our labor spread out before us. "Thank you for teaching me," I said, suddenly aware of how much I had absorbed in just one day. Not just techniques and measurements, but a whole philosophy of creation and care. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You know, in traditional apprenticeships, the learning went both ways. The master taught the apprentice, yes, but the apprentice also brought fresh eyes, new questions." He began to put tools away, each returning to its designated place. Your questions today made me think about things I haven't considered in years. Why I do things a certain way, what I believe about the work. This surprised me, the idea that I could have anything to offer someone with his experience and skill. But I understood what he meant about fresh eyes. There were things he did automatically, movements so ingrained they had become unconscious. My questions forced him to articulate what had become instinctual, to return to the foundations of his craft. As we cleaned up the workshop, sweeping sawdust into neat piles and wiping down surfaces, I found myself already looking forward to returning the next day. There was something deeply satisfying about this work, the tangible progress, the engagement of all my senses, the connection to materials and processes that had remained essentially unchanged for centuries. Same time tomorrow? Mr. Harmon asked as we prepared to leave, and I nodded eagerly. As he locked the workshop door, I noticed how the setting sun caught the silver in his hair, how his profile against the darkening sky looked like something from another time. A craftsman from an era when things were made to last, when the relationship between maker and material was sacred. Walking home that evening, I felt different, more grounded, more present in my body. My hands still carried the memory of wood grain and tool handles, my nostrils the complex sense of the workshop. But more than these physical impressions, I carried with me the moment of connection, the warm breath on my cheek, the shared focus on creating something of beauty and purpose. In the years since that summer, I've thought often about what Mr. Harmon taught me, not just about woodworking, but about attention, about patience, about finding dignity in labor and honesty in materials. I never did use that business degree in the way my parents hoped. Instead, I eventually opened my own small workshop, where I try to approach my craft with the same care and reverence he showed me. And sometimes, when I'm teaching someone new, I find myself standing close, guiding their hands as they make a crucial cut or measurement. Hold steady, I'll say, and feel the circle complete itself. The student becoming the teacher, the lessons passing from one generation of hands to the next, like the grain in a piece of wood, continuous and ever-changing. Total _char_count, 13,927.